Hello all, and welcome again to our study of the book of Exodus, or should I say, our study of God and how we should respond to Him and His deliverance of us as it's related in the book of Exodus. In these brief comments today from Exodus chapters 1 and 2, I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about God and leadership. And first, let's talk about our God. Exodus opens with the announcement that Pharaoh made 3 attempts to keep the Israelites' numbers to a manageable mass. First, you remember, enslavement. He wanted to force them into hard labor. Second, he issued a command to the midwives to kill all Israelite male children at birth. And third, he called for the murder of all male infants by throwing them into the Nile River. What an evil man. However, we are told that one special child escaped Pharaoh's evil intention, and I definitely think that we should attribute the birth and rescue of this special child to God, don't you? Moses' birth story is just one example of a common Old Testament theme, just something here for you to think about. At various crucial junctures, the birth of a child is instrumental to God's plan of delivering His people from some dire situation. We might think of the birth of Isaac, or Joseph, or Samuel, or Samson. Of course, this culminates many, many centuries later in a manger in Bethlehem. And I think one lesson that we should take from this is that the Lord rules despite appearances. I'm sure the Israelites thought that God was absent in Exodus chapters 1 and 2. Where was God when Pharaoh was punishing these people? Where was He? I think the lesson here is that God may appear to be absent, but He's not. God is with His people, even though it does not appear to be so at times. So, that's our talk about God. Let's talk about leadership. The first thing I want to say about leadership is that preparation for leadership begins in the home with parents who trust God and who love God. When I read this text, I wondered what kind of mother would abandon her child like this and make him susceptible to exposure and crocodiles and who knows what else. What grief that mother must have undergone, don't you know? How in the world could she put her baby into a basket made of bulrushes and set that ark, or set that little boat on the Nile River? But of course, this mother has something else in mind, doesn't she? Something else in mind than abandonment or exposure. She's not abandoning her son, no, not at all. She's giving him a chance to survive, isn't she? And her action is expressing a wish, or possibly her hope, for the infant's deliverance. I would like to think that she is trusting in God to care for her son. I imagine that she must have had a plan. She's going to send her daughter Miriam to keep an eye on the miniature ark, and she's going to encourage her daughter to step in for the welfare of that infant if given the opportunity. And sure enough, opportunity knocks when the daughter of Pharaoh sees the boat in the water, and out of pity, she rescues the infant. "Would you like for me to get you a Hebrew nurse for the child?" Miriam asks. "Good idea," the princess replies. And Moses spends some time, who knows how long, he spends some time with his flesh and blood parents. Now, it was during those days that Moses' mother and father had their only opportunity to teach him all they knew about the God of his fathers. And I'm guessing they took advantage of that opportunity, right? And just here I want to say a word to us parents. We have a responsibility, don't we, to train our children in the ways of the Lord. This is an important source of leadership and the preparation of leadership. It's the home, a Christian home with godly parents who take seriously their responsibility to teach their children about God. So, I want to say just here that this text seems to be evidence that leadership and the preparation for leadership begins in the home. Now, the second lesson that I want to talk about here is leadership. And that lesson here is that leaders must learn to deal with rejection. I'm thinking about chapter 2 and verse 14 just here. And you remember the story well, don't you? Moses saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he killed the Egyptian. And the next day, Moses saw two Hebrews fighting. And when he tried to intervene, as leaders do, one of the Hebrews responded, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us?" This verse, chapter 2 and verse 14, introduces two interconnected themes that recur throughout the Pentateuch. First is Israel's rebellion, and the second is the rejection of Moses. Already, he is met with his own people's questioning his authority. One would expect such behavior from the Egyptians, right? But certainly not from those whom he has been sent to deliver. Leaders will have their authority questioned, that's for sure. And their leadership will be rejected. And we who try to lead must learn how to deal with rejection, because it's coming, isn't it? Finally, I want to talk just here about the preparation of a leader. You know, when Moses killed that Egyptian and fled the country, and by the way, don't you find that interesting, that God used a man who once committed murder? I find that interesting. Anyway, back to my point. When Moses killed that Egyptian and had to flee the country, how old was he? He was 40 years old. How do we know that? That's what Stephen tells us in Acts chapter 7 and verse 23, I believe it is. So at 40 years of age, Moses runs away from Egypt and goes into Midian, into the desert. And for the next 40 years, God will be preparing Moses to lead his people out of Egypt. Preparation for leadership. It's important. Now, we learn from chapter 2 and verse 17 that God has something to work with in Moses when Moses comes to the aid of 7 women who were being bullied by some shepherds. But still, Moses must grow into the leadership role that he will fulfill later in life and later in this book. We might even say that the Moses of Exodus chapter 2 must precede the Moses of Exodus 14, where he leads the people out of Egypt. So, just here I want to ask this question. What are we doing to train our future leaders? How are we preparing them for service? I think that's something that we need to be thinking about. Well, my time is up, and I hope to see you again in this medium in a few days when we'll plan to discuss Moses' 5 objections, count them, 5 objections to God's call.